Hey guys, good evening, or maybe a gentle good morning, wherever you are in this big wide world. Tonight, we're going to gently journey back in time. We're heading far from your comfy bed, miles away from those super clean, bright hospital rooms and all that amazing medical tech. We're diving into a past world that, even though it's super old, was totally vital for keeping us all going. Just take a quiet moment and think about your normal day. Maybe your alarm clock is a gentle hum, or you love your warm blanket. You get out of bed onto a clean floor. The air feels fresh and smells great, and you know if you or someone you care about needed a doctor right now, help's just a call away. They'd be there in minutes, armed with knowledge and tools that probably seem like magic. You've got clean water, super sterile places, and that quiet confidence from hundreds of years of science. Doesn't that sound incredibly peaceful? Okay, now let all that melt away. Instead, picture yourself back in time, not at some fun, romantic medieval fair, but into a dimly lit, humble, and often unsanitary little hut where a woman is just twisting in pain. The air's thick with wood smoke, damp dirt, and a subtle, lingering hint of the unseen dangers that cause, well, panic. Your job? To help a new little life arrive into a world full of hidden dangers, and you've got barely anything but old wisdom and a prayer. This, my friends, was the everyday life of a medieval midwife. It was so different from today's midwives that someone from our time just wouldn't last a single day. Before we gently get into all those tough duties, the super limited knowledge, and the truly scary risks these essential women faced, if you find these quiet history trips relaxing and helpful for falling asleep, a little tap on that like button or a quick subscribe would honestly mean so much. It helps more people find these calm journeys into the past. And feel free to share in the comments below where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always nice to know we're all quietly discovering this together, perhaps drifting off as we do. So, with that, time to dim the lights. Maybe turn on a soft fan for some background noise, or just listen to the rain outside. Let's drift together into the super interesting, but maybe a little bit unsettling, realities of a medieval midwife's life. Sweet dreams, and let's start our quiet trip into a forgotten day. The unyielding world of the medieval midwife. The call of the cradle, unrelenting demands, and limited autonomy. In the Middle Ages, when a new life was preparing to arrive, it was almost always considered women's business. That's just how it. Male doctors, with their fancy medical books and Latin phrases, usually stayed away. They often worried about scandalous rumors, or just saw dealing with women's bodies as a bit beneath them, preferring to focus on intellectual discussions rather than the messy, physical reality of childbirth. Guys only got involved in really dire emergencies, or if it was a royal birth and some surgical tools were absolutely necessary. So, right from the start, this created a unique, but also pretty shaky, space for women in healthcare, setting the scene for all the tough stuff they'd face. Imagine, for a moment, being a medieval midwife. There's no shift schedule, no clocking in or out. You are, quite simply, always on call. Always. The sun might have just set, and you finally settle down for a few precious hours of sleep. After a long day of caring for your own family, perhaps spinning wool or mending clothes by the flickering firelight, the sounds of the village are quieting down, maybe a distant dog bark. the gentle rustle of wind through thatched roofs, and the rhythmic chirping of cricket. You're almost drifting off, the rough straw mattress feeling surprisingly soft after a day on your feet. But then it happens, a sharp, insistent rap on your wooden door. Not a polite knock, but an urgent, almost desperate pounding. Your heart leaps into your throat. You know instantly what it means. Someone is in labor. Right now, you quickly pull on your thick, coarse wool tunic, feeling the biting cold seep into your bones from the cracks in the walls. The air inside your humble home is damp, carrying the lingering smell of last night's cooking fire and the earthy scent of the packed dirt floor. You grab your small satchel, already feeling the familiar weight of your simple tools, and a quiet sense of dread mixed with purpose. Stepping outside, the night air hits you like a physical blow. It's often damp and cold, sometimes carrying the complex smell of chimney soot from 100 other tiny hearths, mixed with raw sewage and horse manure that permeates every corner of the medieval town. There's no street lighting, only the faint glow of the moon, or perhaps a few flickering lanterns carried by your frantic escort. The muddy, dirty streets squelch beneath your worn boots, and you have to pick your way carefully to avoid tripping over refuse or slipping in a fresh puddle. This isn't just discomfort, it's a constant physical challenge, even before you reach the birthing chamber. Midwives were absolutely central to medieval community life. They weren't just there for the actual birth, they were primary caregivers for newborns and often helped women with general health issues too. People really valued them, so much so that some midwives even got special perks, like not having to pay certain taxes or getting small pensions. Pretty neat for a medieval woman, right? But here's the catch. Because their services were so vital, they often couldn't just pack up and leave their village or city. Their community needed them, and that was that. And their work didn't end when the baby arrived. Nope, their responsibilities usually lasted for about a month after the birth, which means they were also involved in early postnatal care for both mom and baby. This wasn't just a quick pop in, it was a commit. The rules for them were clear. They had to be diligent and faithful, and ready to help every woman laboring of child, as well the poor as the rich. Think about that for a second. You couldn't refuse a call, whether it was from the richest lady in the castle or the poorest peasant in a tiny shack. It was 24/7, no exceptions, and you were expected to be equally dedicated to everyone. Now, you had a couple of types of midwives back then. There were the professional midwives. These were the rare ones who could actually read and sometimes even got their hands on medical texts. They might even volunteer their services sometimes. But most midwives were lay midwives. They couldn't read or write, usually came from poorer families, and learned everything by watching and doing from their moms, grandmoms, and older village midwives. These lay midwives were the ones that regular folks in both the countryside and cities relied on most. So, while midwifery did give women a rare chance to have some independence and maybe even move up a bit in society, which was a huge deal in a world pretty much run by men, this profession freedom often came with a big shadow. Religious leaders and male political figures were always a bit suspicious. The church, for example, actually liked that midwives had a public role, especially for things like emergency baptisms. If a baby was really sick and seemed like it might not make it, the midwife could baptize it herself to make sure its soul was saved. This was super important. But here's the unsettling part. The church also used midwives as their eyes and ears. They were agents, basically told to keep an eye on women and report things like illegitimate births, or if someone was trying to hide a baby, or, horrifyingly, commit infanticide. While these women had real, practical power inside the birthing room, their bigger professional freedom was always being watched and controlled by outside male authority and moral policing, and controlled by outside male authority and moral policing. For someone like us today, used to being independent in our jobs and always putting our patients first, this constant tension would be incredibly tough. It'd be a psychological nightmare. Imagine the quiet desperation of a mother whispering secrets to you, the heavy silence of unspoken truths, and that constant, gnawing internal struggle as a midwife. You'd have to decide whether to protect your patient's secret or report it to save yourself. It's a weight that would crush a modern professional. And it wasn't just about babies. Midwives had other important public jobs too. They were legally required to tell the authorities about all sorts of private stuff. Think about it. If a baby was born out of wedlock, they had to question the mom and get the father's name. They had to report premature births and those awful cases of infanticide. They even served as witnesses in rape cases. Pretty heavy stuff, right? From the mid 1500s, and even hinting at earlier times, midwives often had to swear these really long, detailed oaths. These oaths spelled out exactly what they had to do. They had to make sure paternity was accurate, stop fake birth claims, protect the baby from harm, promise not to use witchcraft or unlawful prayers, which, by the way, tells you a lot about the suspicions they faced. Charge fair fees, prevent secret deliveries, keep things confidential unless the law said otherwise, make sure stillborn babies were properly buried, and even report other midwives who were doing a bad job or working without a license. This whole setup, especially with church officials often giving out licenses, meant midwives were directly accountable to the government and the church. They were basically informants, forced to police society's morals and report super intimate details about their patients' lives, like who the real father was, or if a birth was secret. This turned their role, which should have been about trust and closeness, into one of surveillance. For a modern midwife who's trained to put patient privacy and sticking up for them above everything else, this would be a massive ethical nightmare. It's just profoundly challenging and emotionally exhausting. And if they didn't follow these rules, serious trouble. They could lose their independence, their license, and their entire way of making a living. Can you imagine that kind of pressure? A blind art, the scarcity of medical knowledge, Anabian germ theory. Now, let's talk about what these medieval midwives actually knew about the human body, especially women's bodies. And, well, it wasn't much. Medieval medical knowledge was super limited. A huge reason for this was that they just couldn't do human dissections. It was mostly forbidden, or just a big no no culturally. Can you believe even diagrams of the womb in old medical books, even from the late 1100s, were totally abstract? And get this, they weren't even based on human female anatomy. They were based on the anatomy of a pig. Just let that sink in. Imagine being a midwife, feeling your way through a birth, with no real idea of what's actually happening inside. It's like trying to fix a complex machine with a blindfold on, relying solely on touch and what you think you know. That profound lack of understanding of the female reproductive system would be terrifying for a modern midwife. Your entire practice today is based on knowing every tiny detail of anatomy, how things work, and what can go wrong. Back then, you'd feel so helpless, so incredibly frustrated. It would be a constant sense of just practicing in the dark, always guessing and hoping for the best. The mental toll of that constant uncertainty must have been immense. And here's another truly mind boggling thing: medieval people generally had no idea about germ theory, none at all. Diseases were often blamed on miasmas, basically bad smells or corrupted air from rotting stuff, or, even deeper, they were seen as punishment from God for sin. Can you imagine that weight? Every illness, every death could be seen as a moral failing. So, imagine the air in that birthing room. It wouldn't just have the smells of wood smoke and damp earth. There would be a thick, sickly sweet odor of decay, a faint metallic tang from illness, and a pervasive mustiness that seemed to cling to every fabric, every surface. This was the air they believed was causing sickness, not tiny, invisible microbes. The idea of washing your hands to actually kill germs, that didn't really become a thing until the mid 1800s. For centuries before, if people washed their hands, it was more for religious rituals or just to get the visible dirt off, not because they understood about preventing invisible infections. Sure, some smart folks like Moses ben Maimon back in 1199 thought hand washing was important in medicine, but again, it was often ceremonial or social, not about microscopic baddies. The terrifying part for a modern midwife is this: you're trained in sterile techniques, you know all about microbiology, and strict infection control is literally your life. But in medieval times, you'd be constantly surrounded by invisible microbial threats. Doctors, and remember, men usually avoided birth, but this example still shows the lack of knowledge, would sometimes go straight from dissecting dead bodies to delivering babies without washing their hands. And no one thought anything of it. This directly led to deadly infections like puerperal fever, which even took the lives of queens. Imagine knowing that every time you touched a laboring woman, every time you assisted in the birth, you could, unknowingly, be bringing death with your own hands. You couldn't see it, couldn't understand it, and couldn't fight it. That constant, unseen microbial threat and the inability to do anything about it would be absolutely horrifying. It would make the work physically and psychologically unbearable due to the constant, unavoidable risk of infection and the knowledge that you might be inadvertently causing harm. That's a burden we can barely fathom today. A blind art. The scarcity of medical knowledge, training, and superstition. So, how did medieval midwives actually learn their craft? Well, forget about going to college or getting some fancy degree. There wasn't any formal education or training like we have today. Their main credentials were usually just how old they were, or if they'd already had several kids of their own. It was all about practical experience, learned mostly by word of mouth from their moms, grandmas, and the older midwives in the village. Think of it as a really informal apprenticeship, hands on learning from a very young age. Future midwives would often just watch births from when they were little kids. Imagine that, spending countless hours observing, listening, and learning through every you'd smell the sweat and blood, hear the sounds of women suffering and the first cries of newborns, and your hands would gradually learn the feel of a laboring body, often through harsh, immediate lessons. It's pretty rare to find books written by women for women in the late Middle Ages. Male doctors, who were the ones writing most of the medical texts, generally just ignored child. They were busy focusing on more important and definitely more profitable problems for men. And get this, women were mostly banned from universities back then, often because students had to take religious vows. So, there was simply no way for them to get any formal medical training or learn from scientific discoveries in an institutional setting. This meant their knowledge was a wild mix. They combined pure superstition with some practical logic and a lot of herbal medicines. For example, they might use birthwort. Imagine its bitter taste and how they hoped it would get contractions going, or wormwood, with its sharp, almost acrid scent for pain relief. And then lady's mantle, perhaps you can picture its soft, damp leaves, used to try and stop bleeding. This reliance on experience and oral stories did keep midwifery going as a super important female dominated field for centuries. But the big downside, no formal standardized education, and women being locked out of academic medical training meant that knowledge piled up really slowly, was very local, and could easily get lost or misunderstood. That's a huge difference from modern medical education, which is all about scientific proof, always learning new things, and sharing the best practices globally. A modern midwife would find relying on unproven practices and having no solid, evolving scientific knowledge deeply unsettling. It would really limit their ability to actually help and understand when things went wrong. Beyond the herbs, midwives and birthing women also put a ton of faith in prayers, charms, and amulets. These weren't just little trinkets. They could be special scrolls of animal skin called birthing girdles that women actually wore during labor. Imagine the feeling of that inscribed vellum against your skin, rough and reassuring, carrying all that quiet hope. Or it might be pieces of coral, shiny lodestones, relics from saints, or specially made amulets. People really believed in their tangible presence and the comfort they might offer. Spells were also used. Good magic was just a part of everyday life. Even though the church officially wasn't a fan, they thought the religious power of signs and rituals could be magically used to help heal someone. This extensive use of charms, amulets, and religious rituals alongside herbal remedies really shows you how people thought back. The physical world and the spiritual world were totally mixed up when it came to healing and childbirth. This wasn't just superstition in our modern way of thinking, it was their accepted science and medicine. It was a holistic approach to health that completely lacked our modern understanding of cause and effect. For a modern midwife who's trained in a totally science based system where everything has to be proven, dealing with a practice where good results were sometimes just credited to a saint's prayer or a magical object, would be a massive cultural and professional shock. Think of the emotional burden of desperately wanting to help, but knowing your most powerful tools were essentially hope and a whispered it highlights the huge gap in how they understood the world and the profound emotional strain of relying on things that simply weren't proven. The birthing chamber, a gauntlet of filth and fear, environment and hygiene. Now, let's step inside the medieval birthing chamber itself. Get ready, because for a modern person, this would be a real shock. Medieval towns were just inherently unhealthy places. You couldn't escape it. The streets, commonly filled with garbage and human waste. Seriously, this led to truly terrible smells that were just always there. Concoction of damp, rotting food scraps, stale urine, and the pervasive, cloying scent of decomposing organic matter. It clung to everything, permeated your clothes, and felt like it coated the back of your throat. This environment was practically a playground for disease. Houses, often made from wattle and daub, basically woven sticks covered in mud and clay, frequently overhung the narrow streets, blocking out what little light and fresh air there might have been. Inside, rats, lice, and fleas were common house guests, happily living in the rushes that were strewn over the packed clay floors. You'd hear the faint scuttling of tiny feet in the walls at night, feel the constant maddening itch of unseen parasites on your skin, and the air would always feel heavy, stagnant, and thick with fine dust. Even though some town leaders in the later Middle Ages tried a few things, like building public latrines, having muckrakers clean the streets, and even some bathhouses or quarantine rules, there just wasn't any big improvement in public health overall. Why? Mostly because they just didn't get what caused diseases. Remember that miasma theory? It stuck around for ages. Plus, their waste disposal was terrible. Those public latrines often just dumped everything into rivers, which were then used for cooking and washing, and the sheer amount of trash was just overwhelming. So, the pervasive unsanitary conditions of medieval life meant that creating a clean birthing environment by today's standards was literally impossible. You could try your best as a midwife, perhaps washing your hands with some olive oil or herbal concoction, but the world around you was just full of bacteria. The water you used, the communal eating dishes, the air itself, everything carried a high bacterial load. A modern midwife, who was totally used to sterile fields, universal precautions, and super strict infection control, would walk into a medieval birthing room and be absolutely horrified. Every single aspect would feel like a gross violation of basic safety. This constant, unavoidable exposure to pathogens would make the work physically and psychologically unbearable. You'd always know that despite all your efforts, you could be inadvertently causing harm just by existing in that environment. It's a truly chilling thought. The birthing chamber, a gauntlet of filth and fear, tools and interventions. All right, let's talk about the tools a medieval midwife had at her disposal. Get ready for a stark contrast to today's high tech equipment. Her kit was incredibly simple, basic, and often well used. She'd carry her supplies in a woven basket or a small satchel. Imagine the rough texture of the wicker or the worn leather against her hand, the weight of it a constant companion. Inside, maybe a wooden tray to keep things somewhat organized. She'd have some linens, likely rough, well washed fabric, probably stiff from line drying in the sun or by a smoky fire. Then, a pair of plain scissors, perhaps a sharp knife for cutting the umbilical cord, and the most important piece of furniture, a birthing stool. Picture a low, sturdy wooden seat with a U shaped opening at the front, maybe chipped and scarred from countless births. Simple, functional, and utterly lacking in any modern comfort or precision. Now for the truly unsettling part, the interventions. When things went wrong, which they often did, medieval midwives had to resort to methods that would seem brutal and utterly horrifying to us. For a swollen belly, that they hoped would speed up delivery, they might rub on an ointment made from fennel. Imagine the strong, licorice like scent filling the close air, the slick feel of the oil as they worked it into the skin, hoping against hope it would somehow help. They would also perform internal examinations to check how things were progressing, using fresh butter or other oils to help assess cervical dilation and try to stretch the opening for the baby. Think of the tactile sensation, the greasy feel of the butter, the midwife's fingers probing, the sheer physical invasiveness of it all, with no pain relief for the laboring mother beyond perhaps a sip of wine or some herbal concoction. But things got really intense. If the baby was in an unnatural presentation, basically in the wrong position, the midwife would anoint her hands with wild thyme oil. Perhaps you can imagine its earthy, slightly pungent aroma mixing with the other smells of the room, and then she would try to manually turn or rearrange the baby inside the womb. This was done entirely without modern medicine, no scans to guide her, just her hands and intuition. Imagine the mother's screams, raw and piercing, the midwife's straining muscles, the horrifying sensation of forcing life into the right position. It's a vivid, agonizing image that speaks volumes about the sheer physical brutality of these necessary interventions. And if the baby was stuck, oh, the methods they used. They included physically shaking the woman, lifting her, or drastically repositioning her. Picture a midwife and perhaps her female assistants physically jarring a laboring woman, trying to use gravity or sheer force to dislodge a baby. You'd hear the heavy gasps of the mother, perhaps the creak of the floorboards under the exertion, and feel the reverberations through her very body. It's a truly desperate measure when no other options exist. Forceps, those crucial modern tools for difficult births, simply didn't exist until the 1600s. This absence meant that medieval midwives had to rely on these extreme physical measures, often with heartbreaking results. After the birth, if all went well, the midwife would then tie and cut the umbilical cord. Typically, they'd leave it about 4 fingers length. Then, the new little one would be bathed, likely in water that was far from pristine, rubbed with salt. Imagine the sting, the raw feel of it on tender newborn skin, and then honey would be put on their palate and gums to try and stimulate their appetite. For a modern midwife, trained in advanced surgical interventions, gentle pain management, and the delicate handling of both mother and child, these medieval methods would be barbaric, deeply distressing, and potentially traumatizing. You'd feel immense physical and psychological toll practicing in such conditions. The only options were often crude and painful, and the knowledge that you couldn't offer anything better must have been a constant, heavy weight. It's a profound thought, isn't it? Life and death, the terrifying. Now, let's talk about the biggest, most terrifying reality for any medieval midwife, the constant presence of deaths. Childbearing in medieval Europe was incredibly risky, a really dangerous event that unfortunately caused a lot of women to die. You might have heard the old saying that 1 in 3 women died in childbirth, and while that's not quite right, it wasn't that high for every single birth. The numbers were still chilling. Pure for even the most privileged women, the ones we have the best records for, about 1.2% of birth still ended in the mother's death. But think about it over a woman's entire life. If she got married and had several kids, Her lifetime risk of dying from childbirth was around 5. That means roughly 1 in every 18 married women would die because of childbirth. Let that sink in. While childbirth wasn't the most common way women died overall, accidents and other diseases were often higher. The risk related to birth was inescapable and highly concentrated in time, meaning for a few weeks around the birth itself, a woman faced about 6 times the normal risk of death. For a modern midwife, whose main goal is to safely deliver both mom and baby, these raw statistics aren't just abstract numbers. They represent a constant, overwhelming presence of death in their everyday professional life. You'd be psychologically devastated by the routine and frequent loss of mothers and babies, often from causes they just didn't understand. The emotional burnout, the profound sense of helplessness and failure would be immense, making the role emotionally untenable for a modern practitioner. What were some of these common, terrifying risks? Well, for women, things like uterine prolapse, where the uterus actually falls out of place, were a serious problem, causing terrible pain and often lifelong suffering. But the absolute deadliest was severe postpartum infection. This was a leading cause of maternal death, tragically shown by how even queens, like Jane Seymour, one of Henry VIII's wives, died from puerperal fever. Her high status didn't protect her from this invisible killer, showing just how vulnerable everyone was. This frequent and brutal reality of postpartum infection brings us right back to that whole lack of germ theory and the unsanitary conditions we talked about. The midwife, despite her best intentions and maybe even washing her hands with oils or herbs, could unknowingly be carrying deadly pathogens, especially with hands on internal exams and interventions. She could inadvertently be a vector for the very thing that killed the mother. There's a tragic irony there. The act of trying to help could sometimes accidentally cause fatal harm. For a modern midwife, armed with knowledge of microbiology and sterile technique, this lack of control over infectious disease would be deeply frustrating, absolutely terrifying, and ultimately just debilitating. Knowing that every successful delivery was, in part, a gamble against unseen forces would be an unbearable weight. And it wasn't just the birthing process itself. The general health of medieval women was often just poor. The early medieval population, especially women, likely suffered quite a bit from malnutrition. Their diets were often inconsistent and just didn't provide enough good stuff. Women frequently had iron deficiencies and anemia, a double whammy caused by bad nutrition, and having babies frequently actually made them die younger, on average, than men. Think about it. Pregnancy, childbirth, and breastfeeding drastically upped a woman's need for calories, protein, and tons of vitamins like A, D, B vitamins, C, and calcium. But their everyday subsistence diet, mostly high fiber grains, beans, and veggies, just couldn't meet those needs. Deficiencies in super important nutrients like B12 and folic acid led to anemias that put both mom and baby at risk and even caused birth defects like spina bifida. Babies born with these issues often died from infections because there was no way to keep things clean and protect their delicate, exposed tissues. Rickets from not enough vitamin D in kids and brittle bones in older women were also really common. So, beyond the immediate dangers of birth itself, the widespread malnutrition of medieval women created this deep, underlying physical weakness, iron deficiency, anemia, and missing key vitamins would totally mess with maternal health, make birth complications way more likely, and weaken both the mom's and baby's immune system. They'd be super vulnerable to disease and less able to handle the trauma of childbirth. This systemic nutritional deficit was a silent, pervasive killer that a modern midwife who knows how critical nutrition is for healthy pregnancies would see as a massive yet completely unfixable factor in medieval death rates. It just adds another layer of hopelessness and frustration to an already impossible job. What a burden to carry. Beyond the bedside, societal scrutiny and witchcraft accusations. So, we've talked about the grueling hours, the lack of real medical knowledge, the terrifying environment, and the constant, heartbreaking presence of death. But there's one more huge layer of sheer terror that a medieval midwife lived with every single day: societal suspicion and the very real threat of being accused of witchcraft. Societal suspicion and the very real threat of being accused of witchcraft. Remember that little bit of independence and professional agency these women managed to carve out for themselves? Well, that wasn't always seen as a good thing by the powerful men of the time, especially those in religious or political circles. Midwives were often painted as witches and backwoods women. Can you imagine being essential to your community, helping bring life into the world, and then constantly being viewed with suspicion, even accused of magic and human sacrifices? Yes, they actually thought midwives might be messing with fetuses and umbilical cords for evil. Healers of all kinds, and especially midwives, were super vulnerable during those scary witch hunts. People were just terrified of their perceived magic power over living bodies. Midwives were extra vulnerable because they knew so much about creating new life, fertility, delivering babies safely, and even forbidden stuff like contraception and abortion. They were the first ones to touch a newborn baby and were privy to deeply intimate and private patient secrets, like if there was adultery or other sexual problems. This gave them immense knowledge and perceived power, which tragically could be easily twisted. They were often accused of killing or stealing babies, sometimes even swapping them out for changelings, which might have just been babies with birth defects that they couldn't help. The pervasive accusations of witchcraft against midwives are a chilling consequence of their unique spot in society. They held this intimate knowledge of the female body and the absolute mystery of birth, often working with remedies and practices like those herbal medicines, charms, and spells that simply looked magical or just plain weird to anyone who wasn't in on it. So, when bad things inevitably happened, which was all the time, given how little they really knew medically, this perceived power could easily be warped into evil intent, especially by male authorities who wanted to control this traditionally female domain. For a modern professional, the constant existential threat of being accused of supernatural evil or infanticide for a medical outcome that was totally beyond their control would be an unimaginable and truly terrifying burden. It would add a profound layer of psychological distress to an already high stakes and incredibly difficult job. How could you possibly keep going with that kind of shadow hanging over you? Midwives were forced to swear oaths that, especially from the 1500s onward, but really showing earlier suspicions, included clear sections saying they wouldn't use witchcraft, charm, or sorcery. This tells you how persistent that societal suspicion was, and if they held back vital information about babies born out of wedlock, abortions, or infanticide from the authorities, they risked losing everything: their independence, their license, and their income, their whole livelihood. Unlike the male medical practitioners, who were getting more organized and formal, midwives really lacked that kind of official structure. This made them super vulnerable to stricter rules and the imposing of male dominated medical hierarchies, which just kept cutting into their autonomy. So, medieval midwives were held legally and morally responsible for outcomes like making sure the baby was safe or reporting infanticide in an era where they fundamentally had no scientific knowledge, no sterile environment, and no modern tools to consistently ensure good results. This created an absolutely impossible situation. They were blamed for failures that were often completely beyond their control, while at the same time being kept away from the formal education and scientific advancements that might have actually improved their practice. A modern midwife, used to a system of professional standards, evidence based practice, and even malpractice insurance, would find this level of arbitrary, life threatening accountability utterly unworkable and morally crushing. It truly makes the profession unsustainable for anyone from our time. What an overwhelming existence. The unseen weight, emotional and psychological toll. So far, we've gently touched on the physical hardships, the lack of knowledge, and the constant threats a medieval midwife faced. But beyond all that, there was an unseen weight, a deep, pervasive emotional and psychological toll that would surely break a modern practitioner. Imagine carrying all of that inside your mind and heart, day in and day out, with no outlet, no real support. The constant witnessing of suffering must have been utterly brutal. Every time you walked into a birthing room, you were greeted by the raw, unfiltered sounds of pain, not the controlled cries you might hear in a modern hospital with epidurals and pain relief, but guttural groans, sharp, piercing screams, and desperate, whispered pleas for help or for it all to just end. These weren't just noises, they were the very soundtrack of your working life. Imagine the rhythm of those sounds, the rise and fall of agony, etched into your memory long after you left the bedside. The visuals, too, would be seared into your mind: the drawn, sweat soaked face of a mother, her eyes wide with fear and exhaustion, her skin pale and clammy or flushed with fever, the raw, visceral reality of a body pushed to its absolute limits, sometimes for days. For a midwife, there would be a constant, gnawing feeling of helplessness when interventions, primitive as they were, failed. You'd try everything in your limited power: the herbs, the manipulations, the prayers, and still, sometimes, death would loom, a cold, silent presence, in the corner of that dimly lit room. That feeling of utter inadequacy must have been soul crushing. And then there was the grief, the constant, heavy burden of frequent deaths. Mothers lost, babies lost. It wasn't a rare occurrence, it was a common, inescapable part of the job. You'd deliver a small, still body, feeling its coldness against your hands, perhaps seeing the tiny, undeveloped features that would never know life. Then you'd have to turn to comfort the heartbroken mother and family, even as your own heart ached with sorrow and the gnawing question of what more you could have done. But there was no time for personal grief, no time for mourning. You simply moved on to the next call, the next labor, the next potential tragedy. The quiet rituals of mourning were often the stark lack thereof in a world where death was so prevalent, would be deeply unsettling. For a modern profession who has access to grief counseling, support groups, and the space to process trauma, this constant exposure to loss with no outlet would inevitably lead to severe emotional burnout and compassion fatigue. Imagine the feeling of a constant, dull ache in your chest, a residue of all the sorrows you'd witnessed, never truly fading. Adding to this emotional burden was profound isolation and a total lack of support. There were no formal debriefing sessions, no mental health professionals to talk to. If you experienced a particularly traumatic birth, a horrific loss, or even a deeply unsettling accusation of witchcraft, you largely bore that burden alone. The secrets you were privy to, the illegitimate birth, the hidden abortions, the private shames, would weigh heavily on your conscience, knowing you were sworn to report, but also intimately connected to the human stories behind them. This informant role created an internal conflict that would be incredibly difficult to reconcile. How could you truly share your experiences, your fears, your moments of doubt with anyone, even your own family? Your work was often considered women's business, and perhaps too gruesome or mysterious for others to truly grasp. The psychological burden of being both absolutely essential to your community, yet simultaneously so vulnerable to accusations and control, would create a profound sense of quiet desperation. It's like feeling a constant cold knot in your stomach, a deep chill that never quite thaws, knowing that your indispensable role could turn against you at any moment. And yet, amidst all this, medieval midwives somehow kept going. There was a grim normalization of hardship. Constant exposure to suffering could, in some ways, harden a person. You'd learn to compartmentalize, to push down the raw emotion, to function. But beneath that hardened exterior, there had to be a deep well of empathy and resilience to continue performing such intimate, high stakes work. The internal conflict between professional compassion and sheer self preservation must have been immense. Imagine the feeling of thick soot clinging to your lungs from the smoky homes and the pervasive bad air of the medieval town. Now try to imagine the emotional equivalent, a sticky, dark residue clinging to your soul from all the pain, the fear, and the death you witnessed. It wouldn't wash off. There was no escape. The weight of knowing that every birth was a desperate gamble, a roll of the dice against invisible forces, and overwhelming odds would be a constant, heavy presence in your thoughts, even in those rare moments of quiet. This relentless psychological pressure, without any modern support systems, without counseling, or even understanding of trauma, highlights why the medieval midwife's life was not just physically grueling, but profoundly damaging to the spirit. It makes their dedication and sheer endurance all the more remarkable, and a modern person's inability to cope all the more understandable. The social fabric and the midwife's place. Community, isolation, and small joys. Beyond the intimate, grueling moments of the birthing chamber, the medieval midwife existed within a complex social fabric. Her role wasn't just medical, it was deeply intertwined with the daily life, beliefs, and anxieties of her community. Imagine the quiet rhythm of a medieval village or town, the distant ringing of church bells, marking the hours and seasons, the low murmur of conversation from neighbors gathered at the well, the occasional shouts of street vendors selling their wares, and the constant underlying sounds of animals, the clucking of chickens, the distant lowing of cattle, the braying of donkeys. The midwife occupied a unique position. She was trusted, almost sacred, for her ability to usher in new life. Yet, as we've discussed, she was also viewed with suspicion. This dual perception meant that every interaction carried a subtle tension. When you walked through the village, people might greet you with deferential nods, perhaps even whispering, "Thanks for a past safe delivery." But you might also catch the wary glances of those who remembered a lost baby or who simply feared your intimate knowledge of life's mystery. The scent of freshly baked bread from a neighbor's oven might mingle with the complex smell of suspicion, a feeling almost as palpable as the damp air after a morning mist. Her livelihood, too, was often precarious. While some might receive small pensions or tax exemptions from the community, actual payment often came in kind: a few chickens, a basket of eggs, a measure of grain, or perhaps a meager handful of corn. Imagine having to calculate your own family's meals based on whether a birth was successful and the family could afford to give you that extra bushel of wheat. The physical sensation of feeling a few rough coins in your palm after a grueling, sleepless night would be a tangible reminder of your precarious existence. The birthing room itself was a complex social event. It wasn't just the midwife and the laboring woman. It was a gathering of women, female friends, neighbors, and family members, often referred to as gossip. Men were generally excluded, with fines even in place for men caught eavesdropping. This created a unique, female centric space filled with the low hum of encouraging voices, shared anxieties, and the quiet support of a female community. You might hear the clink of tankards as warm herbal teas were offered, or the hearty laughter of a neighbor trying to lighten the mood. Smells of warming fires, brewing herbs, and the earthy dampness of the room would fill the air, a backdrop to the more intense smells of exertion and birth. But even within this supportive female circle, the midwife was under immense pressure. Every action she took was observed, every decision scrutinized by women who themselves had experienced childbirth and held their own opinions and superstitions. Imagine the weight of those expectant eyes upon you, hoping for the best, but silently judging every move. The whispers that followed a difficult birth could be as sharp as the winter wind. Amidst all the overwhelming demands and dangers, there were, perhaps, fleeting moments of small joys and profound satisfaction. The sheer miracle of a successful birth, a healthy, squalling newborn placed into its mother's arms, must have been a powerful, redeeming force. Hearing that first strong cry, feeling the tiny, warm body take its first deep breath, seeing the look of exhausted relief and overwhelming love on the mother's face. These were the moments that surely fueled the midwife's endurance. The touch of the newborn's soft skin, the delicate curl of its fingers around your own, a quiet, precious sensation amidst the grit and hardship. Beyond that, perhaps a rare, quiet evening by your own hearth, the comforting scent of wood smoke filling your humble home, the gentle crackle of flames providing a fleeting sense of warmth and security, or a shared meal with your own family, the simple taste of coarse bread and stew feeling like a lavish feast after a day of intense work. These small respites were not luxuries, they were essential fragments of normalcy that allowed the midwife to continue. For a woman in medieval society, where opportunities were incredibly limited, the role of midwife, despite its immense difficulties, offered a path to social standing and a unique purpose. It was a profession almost exclusively for women, giving them a domain of undeniable power and responsibility within a patriarchal world. This profound sense of purpose and indispensable service must have been a deep motivator, a quiet strength that sustained them through the fear, the grief, and the never ending demands. It's a testament to human resilience, even in the face of overwhelming eye. What a remarkable balance between harsh reality and the profound dignity of their essential work. 2. In the unseen lives, children born and lost, and the midwife's legacy. As we delve deeper into the life of a medieval midwife, it's impossible to ignore the constant presence of the children themselves. For every triumph of a healthy birth, there were countless tragedies of lives barely begun. The sheer volume of births that a midwife attended in a lifetime would be staggering by modern standards, and with it, the equally staggering number of tiny lives she saw flicker out. Imagine the sensory experience of welcoming a new baby into the medieval world, the immediate, overwhelming cry of a healthy infant, sharp and insistent, cutting through the tense silence of the birthing room. The smell of fresh amniotic fluid, earthy and saline, mixing with the underlying scents of wood smoke and damp straw. The touch of that tiny, slippery body as you quickly cleaned it, its skin still warm from the womb. You'd rub it with salt, a rough, abrasive sensation against delicate newborn skin, and then coat its palate with sticky, sweet honey, the first suckling at the mother's breast, a gentle, rhythmic sound that spoke of life and continuity, and briefly a sense of quiet triumph for the midwife. But then, imagine the stark contrast, the agonizing silence when a baby failed to cry, the frantic, whispered attempts to revive it, perhaps blowing into its tiny mouth, or gently shaking its limp form, the feeling of coldness creeping into that small body as the life force ebbed, and then the quiet, heavy sigh of resignation from the mother and family, a sound of profound grief that would resonate in the midwife's ears long after she left. Infant mortality was a brutal fact of medieval life, and the midwife was constantly on the front lines of this relentless battle. Many infants died within days or weeks of birth from little understood and wholly unpreventable illnesses. For a modern midwife, accustomed to sterile nurseries and advanced neonatal care, this would be utterly devastating. You'd see babies succumb to infections that today are easily treated, or to congenital conditions that could now be managed or even prevented The feeling of holding a tiny hand that slowly grew cold, or hearing the faint, struggling breaths of a fading infant would be a constant source of quiet heartbreak. The physical sensation of the rough shroud prepared for a tiny corpse would be a recurring, painful memory. The midwife was often responsible for the ritual preparation of these lost babies, ensuring proper burial, even if it was just in unconsecrated ground. This ritualistic duty placed another heavy weight upon her soul, tying her directly to the grief of the community and the fragility of life itself. She would witness the profound sorrow of parents burying child after child and carry those unspoken stories within her. And yet, through all this, the medieval midwife left an undeniable legacy. Every successful birth she facilitated was a direct contribution to the survival and continuation of human society. Without these women working tirelessly in the harshest of conditions, the very fabric of medieval life would have crumbled. Their hands, though rough and worn, were the primary connection between generations, guiding new souls into a difficult world. Imagine her enduring presence throughout the lives of the children she brought into the world, seeing them grow, albeit in a harsh environment, from a tiny infant to a child, then an adult. These moments of connection, seeing the fruits of her desperate labor, must have offered a deep sense of quiet satisfaction and enduring purpose. Her legacy wasn't written in books or etched in stone, but lived on in the families she helped create, in the very continuation of life itself. It's a powerful thought, knowing that their everyday, unglamorous struggle formed the bedrock of human survival. For centuries, their quiet heroism in the face of such overwhelming odds is a testament to the profound strength of the human spirit. The midwife in the law, licensing, oversight, and punishments. That bottle of filtered water on your nightstand, pure beyond the immediate concerns of life and death within the birthing room. The medieval midwife also operated under a very real, sometimes heavy, shadow of the law and official oversight. This wasn't a modern system of professional boards or malpractice insurance. It was a much more personal and often arbitrary form of control. To, from the 16th century onwards, and certainly reflecting earlier trends of increasing scrutiny, midwives were often required to acquire formal licenses to practice. These licenses were usually granted by bishops or other church officials. Imagine the scene: a woman, perhaps elderly and illiterate, having to stand before a stern, robed clergyman, answering questions about her skills and her moral character. The air in the bishop's chamber might smell of old parchment, beeswax, and the heavy scent of authority. Her rough wool tunic would feel coarse against her skin in this unfamiliar, intimidating setting. This licensing process wasn't primarily about ensuring medical competency as we understand it. No, it was often more about control and morality. The authorities wanted to ensure that midwives wouldn't engage in forbidden practices like witchcraft or abortion, and that they would report sins or suspicious activities within the intimate confines of the birthing chamber. This forced the midwife into a very uncomfortable position, a trusted confidant and an agent of the state church. The moral dilemma of this role would create a constant, quiet hum of anxiety beneath the surface of her daily work. And the oaths they swore, as we lightly touched on, were incredibly detailed and binding. Imagine having to promise before God and man to ensure accurate paternity, meaning you had to pressure a woman to name the father even if she didn't want to, prevent false claims of birth, protect the child from harm despite your limited tools, and explicitly avoid any unlawful prayers or witchcraft's last clause alone highlights the immense suspicion they faced. The penalty for breaking these oaths was severe, not just spiritual damnation, but the very real risk of losing her license, her independence, and her entire income. She could be ostracized by her community, banished, or worse. This created an impossible paradox for the midwife. She was held legally and morally responsible for outcomes like preventing harm to the child or reporting infanticide in an era where she fundamentally lacked the scientific knowledge, the sterile environment, and the medical tools to consistently ensure positive results. For a modern midwife, this would be utterly unworkable and morally crushing. Imagine the heavy, cold grip of fear in your stomach with every difficult birth, knowing that if things went wrong, you might be blamed for forces beyond your control. The feeling of sweat beating on your brow, not just from exertion, but from that constant low level terror of being found wanting by authorities who understood so little about the realities of childbirth. The enforcement of these rules could be quite arbitrary. Complaints might come from disgruntled families, rival healers, or even from a midwife's own gossips if a birth went particularly poorly or if secrets were revealed. Investigations, if they happened, would be rudimentary, relying heavily on testimony and community whispers. Imagine the tension in the village, the subtle shifts in demeanor from people who once relied on you, now looking at you with suspicion. The harsh public shaming, the loss of respect, would be a deep wound to a woman whose entire identity was tied to her service to the community. This lack of formal organization among midwives, unlike male medical practitioners who often formed powerful guilds to protect their members and dictate terms, made them incredibly vulnerable. They couldn't collectively bargain, couldn't truly defend themselves against unfair accusations or overly strict rules. This also meant they were often at the mercy of male dominated medical hierarchies that sought to control and marginalize them. Their autonomy, that precious sliver of independence they possessed, was constantly being curtailed. For a modern midwife, used to advocating for her patients, for her profession, and operating within a system of clear legal frameworks and peer support, this would be an intolerable situation. The emotional burden of being a crucial, indispensable part of society, while simultaneously being constantly policed and unprotected by that very society's laws, would be profoundly exhausting. It's a testament to their immense strength that they persevered through such challenging and often unjust circumstances. The midwife's own body, aging, illness, and the end of service. Beyond the physical and emotional tolls we've already explored, let's consider one final harsh reality for the medieval midwife: the relentless impact of her profession on her own body over time, and the stark absence of any concept of retirement or dignified old age. Remember how we talked about the malnutrition of medieval women, the iron deficiencies, the anemias, the brittle bones? A midwife would be just as, if not more, susceptible to these conditions. Her body would be constantly exposed to damp, cold, and unsanitary environments at all hours. Imagine the persistent ache in her joints from endless nights spent kneeling on cold, hard packed earth floors or crouching for hours over a birthing stool. The damp air would seep into her muscles, leaving her stiff and sore with each hue dawn. Her hands, her most crucial tools, would become rough, calloused, and perhaps permanently gnarled from repeated, forceful manipulations and exposure to cold water and harsh substances. The very act of living and working was a slow, grinding process of physical deterioration. Beyond the chronic aches, consider the risk of injury. A laboring woman in extreme pain might inadvertently kick or lash out. Maneuvering a baby into the right position often involved immense physical strain on the midwife's own back and arms. A twisted ankle on a dark, that muddy path during a hurried night call could mean weeks of lost income and immense personal suffering with no sick pay or disability support to fall back on. The physical integrity of her own body was directly linked to her ability to survive and provide for herself and her family. And what about illness? The midwife, by the very nature of her work, was constantly exposed to every disease that swept through her community. She would be present in homes afflicted by smallpox, typhus, dysentery, or the recurring waves of plague. Imagine the lingering smell of sickness, perhaps the metallic tang of fever sweat, the sweet decay of infected wounds, or the pungent odor of vomit and waste, clinging to her clothing and hair, a constant reminder of the invisible enemies she faced. Every cough from a patient, every rash, every fever was a potential threat to her own life. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics, no understanding of how diseases spread. If she fell ill, her care would be as rudimentary as that which she offered to others. There was no sick leave, no one to cover her duties if she was incapacitated. Her illness meant her family suffered and the community lost an indispensable helper. The fear of catching a deadly contagion and bringing it home to her own children must have been a crushing anxiety, a cold dread that followed her from one bedside to the next. And what happened when a midwife grew old or too infirm to continue her arduous duties? There was no concept of retirement as we know it today. No pensions, no savings, no social security. She would continue to work as long as her body allowed, perhaps transitioning to a more advisory role for younger midwives, or simply fading into poverty as her physical capabilities waned. Her worth was tied to her utility, and when that utility diminished, her place in society became tenuous. Imagine the bittersweet feeling of training a younger woman, passing on decades of hard won knowledge and brutal experience, knowing that she too would face the same relentless challenges, the same heartbreaks, and the same lonely burden. The physical sensations of an aging body, the stiffness of mourning, the persistent ache in her joint, the difficulty in rising from a kneeling position would be a daily, inescapable reminder of a life spent in strenuous, unwavering service. Her legacy would be the lives she saved, the families she helped build, and the wisdom she passed down through generations, often without any formal recognition or lasting monument. These, a quiet testament to the profound strength required to simply endure in such a demanding and unforgiving profession. Conclusion: a day you wouldn't survive. And just like that, we've gently journeyed through a day, or maybe more accurately, a deep dive into the entire life of a medieval midwife. It's a life that was truly defined by relentless hardship, by the constant struggle against unseen dangers, and by a profound weight of responsibility with almost no real tools to bear it. We've seen how these women were absolutely essential to their communities, always on call and deeply committed to helping every single woman who needed them, no matter how poor or how rich. But this vital role came with a huge price. Their independence was constantly under scrutiny, and they were forced into a double role as both trusted healer and informed, into a double role as both trusted healer and informer. We also explored the truly staggering lack of medical knowledge they operated with. Imagine having only pig anatomy diagrams to understand the complexities of the human body, or no concept whatsoever of germ. Every single touch could unknowingly spread deadly infection, a horrifying gamble that was simply part of their everyday reality. Their training was informed you, passed down by word of mouth, a mix of practical experience and deep-seated belief in charms and prayers, a stark contrast to the rigorous scientific education modern midwives receive. And then the birthing chamber itself, a place where pervasive filth and invisible pathogens created an environment that a modern professional would find utterly unbearable. Their crude tools and often brutal interventions, shaking women, manually turning babies without pain relief, speak volumes about the desperate measures they had to take in the face of complications they couldn't truly comprehend. The terrifying odds of death for both mothers and infants were a constant shadow. Maternal malnutrition was a silent, pervasive killer, weakening bodies and making every birth an even greater risk. And finally, the chilling threat, being accused of witchcraft for outcomes entirely beyond their control, added a profound and existential layer of fear to an already impossible profession. Perhaps now you have a much clearer understanding of why a modern midwife, with all her scientific training, sterile equipment, pain management techniques, and legal protection, would truly find the medieval birthing chamber a horrifying, impossible environment. The sheer physical, emotional, and professional toll from the constant exposure to disease and death, to the lack of effective interventions, and the ever present threat of social condemnation and accusations of evil, would render the role utterly unbearable. Indeed, a modern individual would not last a single day as a medieval midwife. Thank you for joining me on this gentle yet unvarnished historical journey tonight. Thank you for lending your precious time to listen and to ponder the incredible resilience of those who came before us. I hope these quiet explorations have offered you a moment of peace and a gentle passage into slumber. Now, let these thoughts slowly dissolve like wisps of smoke from an ancient hearth, drifting into the stillness of the quiet night. Let the faint echoes of unseen struggles and untold courage guide you into a deep, peaceful sleep. Sweet dreams, and may your rest be truly undisturbed.